All right. Well, this is a continuation of the last lesson, so I'm actually going to rocket back up several slides just to go over a few quick bullets. We won't go over every detail, but the theme here for this lesson is God's dilemma. The previous lesson, this entire thing is about the atonement. The previous lesson was about the difficulties in man that God has to overcome in atoning and making reconciliation between God and man. The atonement is not just strictly a legal thing that happens or a commercial transaction that happens. The atonement has to do with reconciling a real personal relationship between God and man. So the previous section was about man's problems and those difficulties related to man. This section is what I'm calling God's dilemma. And it has to do with the things in the relationship between God and man that pertain specifically to God. And the reason it's a dilemma is that God's overall disposition or personality, his character, is ultimately love. The Bible is clear on that in the Old and New Testament. I'm not going to talk about these slides, we're just going to hit these main bullets. But his disposition is love. One of the attributes of God's love is his mercy. That's his willingness to withhold punishment. Personally, he would rather withhold penalty. He would rather not spank you. He would rather find a wise way not to have to inflict suffering upon the guilty party. He has a disposition personally to forgive. Who would like to define forgiveness? And if you'd like to read about how Jesus defines forgiveness, we spent a lot of time reading and talking about Matthew 18, 21 through 35. You don't have to refer to that, but would somebody like to define forgiveness as you remember it? While I get a drink of water.
Releasing of debt.
The releasing of a debt. Okay. Anything else? If somebody owes a debt and you forgive it, it's not that somebody else paid it. It's that you just take the hit and say, don't worry about it. That's the way we would say it personally in a day-to-day kind of way. So there's a penalty that is due to be inflicted on the guilty party under God's government. But God's preference, what he personally would like to happen, is not to inflict that, but to just let it go. And I can send you the notes if you guys are really interested, if you want to go through all the scriptures. By the way, that was something this weekend that came up. People were asking for my notes. I didn't even think about that in this class. But if you guys ever want my notes, you're welcome to have them. Just ask me if you have a hard time writing down all the scriptures we go through. So just let me know. So his personal disposition is to forgive. We talked about how forgiveness is the same thing as pardon. Pardon does not declare the guilty party not guilty. When Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon, I'll read the quote again, he came under scrutiny by the House Judiciary Committee afterwards saying, "Why did you not procure a confession or admission of guilt from Nixon before pardoning him?" You understand? He didn't get it in writing from Nixon saying, "I'm guilty of these charges." He didn't. Ford's response to the committee, and the entire interchange is online. I found it very interesting. But at the end, Ford's response was, "The acceptance of pardon, according to the legal authorities, and we have checked them out very carefully, does indicate that by the acceptance of pardon, the person who has accepted it does, in effect, admit guilt." The acceptance of pardon does, in effect, admit guilt. And I'm not saying that the biblical definition is that, because that's what Gerald Ford said. I'm saying Gerald Ford expresses or demonstrates a universal truth of what pardon and forgiveness is with relation to government, because God has a government. What kind of government does God have? A monarchy. A kingdom, right? Yeah. Sometimes it's hard for us to get our minds around it because we don't live under that anymore. Though I think some people wish we did. But anyways, moving on. So it's very difficult to show mercy and forgiveness, and to suspend justice. I recommended everybody last week, I actually watched the televised presidential pardon that Gerald Ford gives of Nixon back in, was it 70? I don't remember what the year was. I had it in my notes. Anyways, I wasn't alive yet. But I went back and I watched it. It's about 10 minutes long. I recommend you listen to it. You'll hear all of these themes come out. And I had written all my notes way before I'd ever watched this. But it was blowing my mind. Hearing Gerald Ford's personal convictions come out. And then he also contrasts them with his governmental duties and responsibilities. And you can hear how he has tried to weigh the two to show mercy and forgiveness to a colleague and a fellow Republican and a fellow man under God's government. He talks about that. It's wild. And there's a tension between mercy and forgiveness being balanced with justice, which is actually what the law requires, because law requires justice. And once you've broken the law, there's no way to be made right by law. And that's why one of the notes I made was pardon is an action of the executive party. Pardon is a favor. Pardon is nothing that the law provides for you. It's something that the executive party can only dispense or give to the guilty party if they can wisely do so. But it is a gift. It is a grace. It is a favor. And that's what pardon or forgiveness is. So, we've been talking about God's personal disposition, his personal desires, what God would rather happen if he could. But man has made things really difficult, right? Man has really, really screwed up. So, he personally prefers mercy and forgiveness over judgment and execution of penalty. But God has a public responsibility to secure the highest good for the universe. And that goes beyond just securing the good of an individual. But this is all part of his loving character. So let's define justice. Justice is the constant and perpetual disposition to render every man his due. It is to perform what is exactly right or deserved in that situation. So, what is just in the following situations? I want you guys to interact with me. What is just in this situation? The gumball machine, right? My life revolves around kids and candy and gumballs. We've established that. That is the depth of theological training you're getting here today. But I actually think there's a lot to learn from it. So a gumball machine rips you off. You put the quarter in, you get nothing. Crank, and you open the little slot, there's no gumball. What is just? Get that stinking gumball, right? That's what's just. Daddy, I didn't get my gumball. Now this was a funny thing, because literally before last class, the week before, my son, if we go to the mall, they gotta go to the gumball machine. I'm like, you guys know there's gumball machines like everywhere in public, right? But in their minds, it's at the mall. So they're always like, can we go to the mall to go to the gumball machine? So they run for those gumball machines when we go there, and Tor puts in a quarter, and he turns the crank, and somehow 5 gumballs come out. That would be beyond justice, wouldn't it? If there'd been a person giving that out, that would have been grace. Now, the machine didn't obviously do that. That was just...
injustice for the 4 people before him.
It was injustice for the 4 people before him. Maybe. Was it an injustice to the person who sells the gumballs? I don't know. But hey, it's their fault. They need to get a working machine. So do you understand justice? If you put a quarter in and it says you get a gumball, you better get a gumball. What would be just to correct that, though? Let's say you didn't get the gumball. What would be exactly just?
Get your quarter back.
Get your quarter back somehow, right? Somebody would need to make that right. How about in this situation? You borrow a friend's car and you wreck it. What is just?
Get it fixed. Restore the car.
Get it fixed. All right.
Make it right however the owner of the car thinks is necessary.
That's really good. Make it right however the owner of the car thinks is necessary. Should you apologize?
Yes.
Yeah, right? That happened to me when I was at Teen Mania one time. I lent my car to somebody, and thankfully she didn't wreck it bad. But she came back an hour later, and sure enough, she'd run it into the loading dock wall. and smashed in the bumper. You know, it wasn't severe, but it was just like, now what are you going to do about it? You know? And it was made right. She made it right. So we understand that. But there'd be a personal correcting or justice that goes on there, as well as the monetary or the property. How about if you share information about someone, but then it turns out later that that information wasn't true? Maybe you innocently shared some information about a person, and later on you go, oh, I misinformed these 3 people about my friend. What is just in that situation?
Apologize, restore the truth that you didn't.
Mm-hmm.
To the 3 people, go and tell them what the truth is.
Right, so apologize to the individual whom you misrepresented, and
Tell the truth to the 3 people.
right, restore the truth to the 3 people.
You may also feel a responsibility to make right any wrongs that misunderstanding
Brought, yeah.
brought
Mhm.
about.
Damage to character.
That's true. If those 3 people acted
You're
upon...
supposing you said something that was derogatory, not that you said something great and then you found out they weren't really that.
Right. But I mean, even still, if you gave credit where credit wasn't due, if somebody misrepresented me and said, Joel did this amazing thing, and it really wasn't true, I still would want them to correct it.
Yeah.
I don't want to be misrepresented in a good light.
Like Jim Patton, formerly of the Beatles.
Jim Patton, formerly of the Beatles. I might need to get on Snopes and see if that's true. That doesn't seem right to me. But who can trust Snopes, right?
That's right.
Who fact checks them? But that's a good point. If those 3 people acted upon that misinformation, you might need to scramble and go see if you can't correct that. And that's why untruth is so damaging. It has that ripple effect that Tim talks about. You know, any kind of sin has a ripple effect in the universe. Your choices, good or bad, have a ripple effect on into eternity.
And there's so many times when it's just not possible to fix it.
Right. Sometimes it's just not possible to fix it. And we need the Lord all the time, but we really need the Lord with that. But the cool thing is God is really good at unconventionally and unexpectedly restoring things. You know, he does that. How about this last situation? A person commits a crime for which the penalty is 5 years in prison. What is just in that situation?
You go to jail for 5 years.
Go to jail for how long?
5 years.
4 years and 364 days?
Oh, all right.
Pretty close, right? I heard of a situation where a man was in jail for potentially, I think it was about 10 years. And in the 9th year, now he'd been on good behavior. He was recommended for good behavior. In the 9th year, his wife at home had become terminally ill with cancer. And they let him go about 9 months early. It's interesting how suffering has something to do with penalty. And when suffering is underwent or experienced by one party, our minds understand that suffering can replace penalty. We'll talk about that a little more in depth. But the public, let me say this, the warden or the governor would have to demonstrate to the public why it was just to reduce the sentence of a guilty party. And in that situation, I can see that that would be just, but only because that guy had been good. If that guy had had an attitude and said, I'm gonna do what I did again as soon as I get out of here, they wouldn't have let him out on any condition early. He might not have even gotten out, right? But in that situation, we could see that it was just to maybe reduce the penalty a little bit. But strict justice would, in this situation, a person commits a crime for 5 years. 5 years exactly is just. What if they kept him for 1 more week? We just want to keep you around for 1 more week. 5 years and a week.
No, thank you.
No, in fact, that guy could appeal to the law. He could make an appeal to justice, and justice would actually be in his favor. He'd be justified by law to say, no, the law protects me, that I am not obligated to stay here a day longer than 5 years if I've met the conditions of law. Do you guys see that? A lot of law talk. There's a lot of law talk in the Bible too. A lot. So it's good to understand these principles. In fact, did you know that our entire system of law is built upon what's called English common law? In English common law, the foundation of the ideas of justice, the ideas of mercy, the ideas of pardon and penalty, they all have their roots in the Bible. The original law dictionaries that our American lawyers and English lawyers developed their concepts of law and justice, and those are the ideas that have been handed down to us. They're all built upon the Bible. They all reference the Bible. In the oldest law books, they reference the Old Testament and those types of things. So, you know, nobody has invented these ideas out of nowhere. They have their foundations in a biblical worldview. So I'm not making stuff up here. But our ideas don't come from nowhere.
No, that's why Charles Finney got saved, because he had to study the Bible.
That's right. That's right.
Lawyer.
Yeah, Charles Finney started to look at the Bible, and let me tell you, Charles Finney was a church-going guy. He actually led a church choir. He was a musician, and but he wasn't saved. And as he was studying law in his 20s, you're right. Was it Black's Law or Blackstone? I get the two law books confused. Wow. It was Black's Law Dictionary. He had to start learning law because he was a law student, and he was very, very meticulous in his study, and he started looking up the biblical references for the pursuit of his law degree for his own interests, and he started to come under conviction and put two and two together logically, and he started to have his conscience, I think, woke up, and he began to realize he needed to answer to the Bible and answer to the God of the Bible, and his life was changed, and a lawyer got saved and made great contributions to revival in America.
Well, we need a lot more lawyers to get saved.
We need more lawyers to get saved, yeah. For real, instead of the other way around. Okay, good. Well, I think you guys are tracking with me on justice. So God will be just according to perfect intelligence and wisdom. He cannot be unjust. To be unjust would be to render what is untrue for any given situation. So understand that the words just and righteous in the Bible are actually synonymous. Sometimes you'll read the word Jesus the just, and in another translation it'll say Jesus the righteous. If God makes us just, he makes us righteous. Okay? It's not strictly a legal thing on paper. I know you're still sinning all the time, but you're righteous. No, it means he literally makes you righteous. He puts you back in the proper order of things morally with the universe. To make things right where there is chaos is to make it righteous. Does it make sense? If something is out of order, out of line with the truth, to bring it back into its proper order is righteous. And when a person is morally out of whack, when a person's driving their F1 car off the side of a cliff like a rock bouncer, like I talked about weeks ago, righteousness is to say, no, you're driving it wrong. Quit driving your car like a maniac and drive on the road according to the precepts that are required for that car to function properly. And that's what God does with us morally. That's making us righteous. It's returning us to obedience, returning us to our proper order morally and relationally with him. So, love and justice. Is there a conflict? God is loving, but he's also just, we hear.
No,
Why not?
because we deserve whatever wrong, the result of any wrongs.
Yeah, we are deserving, if we've transgressed the law, we are deserving of penalty. So, go ahead, Dee.
Because justification, if we have not done anything wrong, because we are righteous, then justice does not condemn us. But if we have encroached upon justice and done something out of the boundaries that have been set for us as human beings, or in our society, or whatever, then love would require that be taken care of, because it's not just about us.
Right.
It's about everyone.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, love is not just about us. I just want to make sure the recording hears it. Love's not just about us, it's about everyone. And so sometimes love and justice are seen as they're polar opposites, or they're against each other, or they're, two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, depending on which definition of love.
That's right.
Yeah.
So we hear this idea, God is love, but he's also just. They're not really in conflict if you understand what love is. And we talked about what love is a long time ago. I think Tim got into that months ago. If you see love as a feeling or an attitude of sentiment or the state of the sensibilities, if you're in my, did anybody come out? Y'all came to my breakout. Y'all came to my breakout. So if love is seen as a feeling, and then you have to exact justice contrary to your feelings, then yes, they would be in conflict.
That's like when you're talking about God's disposition.
Right.
If you call that love, then justice would be in conflict with his.
That's right. So in a way, we could say that justice is in conflict with, I'm not saying God is in conflict with himself, so anybody listening, that's not what I'm saying. But if God is not wanting to exact justice because personally he would rather forgive. But if love is his main characteristic of his character, justice is an attribute of his love. You don't have a good and loving judge who does not enforce the law properly. Rodney, you've got something good to say, I bet.
Part of it has to do with the relationships God has toward his creation. He's not only the creator, he's a governor.
That's right.
And those two relationships carry with them different responsibilities. And the relationship of a governor is one of justice, of maintaining order and a reasonable control over people running amok. The relationship of a father is one of nurturing, of looking for the best in everything. And it's not that those relationships are contrary to each other, but they do come in conflict on occasion, or tension is the word that theologians love to use nowadays, but there is a tension between the two.
No, that's very good. Yeah, God is personal, but he is also a governor. And that's the next thing we're getting onto. Isn't it funny how when the president starts golfing too much, whoever the president is at the time, people start taking note of how many vacation days he's taken. How many golf games has, I remember reading in the news, Obama's already taken more golf trips than even George Bush, the conservative channels would point out. Is that really important? It is, isn't it? Because we represent, if our governor, our president is in charge of securing the good of our government, our society, and he's off blowing it on his own personal time, the public starts to take notice and attention of that. So God has responsibilities governmentally to tend to. And I don't think God would play golf because golf is terrible. God did not invent golf. I tried it once. It's clearly demonic. Yeah, Brian.
I have an example of what you're talking about. And this is embarrassing for me to say, but...
Well, is it too embarrassing for you to say for the recording? Because this is going to be on the internet.
It's okay, because it's a learning experience.
Okay.
We were under a fire ban. And then I had some trash, and we had recently had some rain. I looked on the internet, different websites, and it said that we were off the the fire ban. And I saw where the fire ban was still, but our Smith County was not listed. And so I thought, okay, I can burn my trash. I lit it on fire. Here came the fire truck, threw on his lights, parked in front of my house, and the henchman came out and said, "We need to talk to you. Are you under a fire?" And so I realized that he said, "Did you call the fire marshal?" No. Did I need to? It said, and he said, "No, the websites are wrong. You got to call the Lindale Fire Department." Oh, I didn't know that. I've never had that. And so the fireman was standing in authority, saw that I had made an effort, but I had faulty information. He gave me, I said, I've never had a ticket. I want to obey the law. I got bad information. And so he looked, and still the fire truck and the
that's
neighbors are wondering,
if
he got caught.
If the fireman had been your best friend or your brother, he still would have to show up. He still would have to correct the situation. But I find that I've only gotten one speeding ticket, and I've gotten pulled over, a handful of times. I find that if you're really, really polite, I think it goes a long way. So that they don't execute the full extent of the penalty upon me.
Better hope no officer hears what you just said.
Every police officer is going to hear what I just said. But that's true. I mean, they have to, even if you did that on an accident, but the authorities of the law still has to come and protect society at large. So
God stands in grace, and the fireman stood in grace, saw the intention of my heart.
Yeah, that might have been part of why that happened. So it's one thing to overlook a personal offense, but it's dangerous for government to overlook a public offense. So let's discuss why. So God is responsible for his kingdom, right? This is what you were just talking about, Rodney. He's most qualified and capable to uphold the public good. He's most qualified and capable. What if he was super smart and had no power, no ability to carry it out? What if he was the smartest being in the world and he was just trapped in a little closet in the corner of the universe? Do we put him in charge of the universe? No. What if, let's flip it. What if he was absolutely powerful and 100% evil? And all he wanted to do is inflict suffering and misery on everybody. Is he qualified? He's not qualified.
That's what some people think already.
But he'd be capable. He wouldn't be very good for the job, would he?
Talking about capability, though, we're talking about justice, right? Things that are right.
Yeah. But this is why God is responsible. He is responsible because he is both qualified and capable. That makes him responsible. When God created moral beings, the nature of that relationship is that he is responsible. When my first son was born, the relationship of father, the title of father, was inherently there. Mm-hmm. In a sense, I think my son made me a father.
Yes.
I made my son, so to speak, but the presence of him in this life made me a father. It created a new type of relationship. New types of responsibilities were inherently present all of a sudden because of the nature of the relationship of father and son. And when God creates another moral being, that by nature of the relationship that now exists, there are new responsibilities for both parties. I don't think God has to create those responsibilities. You just can't not have those responsibilities and obligations. Does that make sense? Or am I using too many big words? Are we good? Rodney?
He did accept those responsibilities as the one who was most qualified.
Mm-hmm.
He realized nobody else could do that as well as he could. And so it became a self-obligation for him to become the moral governor.
Right. I believe he knew that would obligate him to do so. So given that the sinner is guilty, I'm going to preface these things. Given, with the same phrase, given that the sinner is guilty and that God is just, what does the penalty of the law communicate about the law? What does the penalty of law communicate about that law?
It shouldn't be trifled with.
Shouldn't be trifled with. The thing it protects has value, right? I researched how much does your usual running a stop sign fee cost. And across the country, it's between $100 and $400 to run. It's probably, I don't know what it is around here because I've not run a stop sign, but cops are listening, remember. But that monetary fee or penalty represents to society that that stop sign protects something in the society. And if you run that stop sign, you're endangering society. And the way we reflect that to the public's mind is we're going to hit your pocketbook, hit your wallet with something of value to you because you're infringing upon something of value to society. Does that make sense? So the penalty of a law communicates the value of the thing the law protects. Do you guys get that phrase? So given that the sinner is guilty and God is just, can God just let the sinner go free without inflicting the penalty of the law? No, we see that he can't. Not wisely. Have you ever heard of a person, a serial killer, who would have multiple life sentences? How many life sentences can one human being live? One. When I was little, I would hear that in the news and I would think, that guy he killed 27 people. 27 life sentences? Why don't they just say one life sentence? Can't get out of prison. Stay in prison till you die. Isn't that interesting? The law can't inflict more than one life sentence, but the charge, the public charge on record and displayed to the public is 27 life sentences because it reflects the value of the thing that was taken. Each life has the value of at least the life of that other person. So the law has to reflect the value of the thing that that person took away legally. But the law has no more power to do than just the one life sentence. But I think that's very interesting how law recognizes that. What if God does not enforce the penalty? What does that say of his command to obey the law? If God does not enforce the penalty, what does that say of his command?
He doesn't appreciate it.
The sinner doesn't appreciate it?
No.
Oh, pardon me, I'm sorry. Yes, that God does not appreciate it. He doesn't take his own command very seriously, right?
Doesn't value it.
He doesn't. God himself doesn't value the law, right?
It speaks to possible unfaithfulness on his part.
Mm-hmm. He would be unfaithful to his law.
Or to the people who he has the relationship to protect.
Mm-hmm. That might be on the next slide. No, it's okay. You guys are all on the same page with me. So let me ask you this. Can God allow the practicing sinner into his kingdom and still be good?
No.
Why not? Why can't he just let sinners into heaven?
It would be trashing his authority, trashing the law.
Also, it would be an insult to people who had obeyed the law.
Hmm?
It would be a disservice to them and say you did all of that at cost to yourself
Mm-hmm.
for no reason.
It would corrupt heaven itself.
That's what I think. It would corrupt heaven. It would be very quickly just like earth, or worse. God, one of the speakers last night talked about the cities in our country that he's preached in, the ones that are seemingly the most far from God, where their laws have been most affected, and they just want everything to be natural. He said, well, what grows naturally? Weeds. So the whole city, all the green spaces, they're just full of weeds. I think heaven would just become full of weeds, full of tares. Do you have unrighteous people in heaven tempting and influencing righteous people to join them? It might be like the fall of the angels that we believe happened. That's why God had to get those rebellious angels out of there, so that they don't influence others to unrighteousness and sin. Why can't God have fellowship with sinners? What would that say of God's character? That he's not pure? That he
doesn't mean what he says.
Doesn't mean what he says?
Like a passive parent.
Like a passive parent? Yeah, like he approves of their behavior, right?
Not dealing with it, is interpreted as approval.
Not dealing with it becomes interpreted as approval. That's great. Galatians 2:17 says, "But if, while seeking to be justified in Christ, we ourselves have also been found sinners, is Christ then a minister of sin? May it never be." He justifies sinners, he makes them right, but he doesn't justify people in sin, nor does he justify sin. So how can God be just to, pardon me, I'm on the wrong slide. To be just or righteous, the penalty or sanctions of moral law must be enforced. Now, sanctions can be penalties, but they can also be rewards. Typically, we hear in the news sanctions imposed upon a country
Right.
are usually a bad thing, but they can be rewards too. Penalties or rewards are motivations to obey the law. So how can God be just to his law, given that he's merciful and wants to forgive? How can he be just to his law and still forgive sinners?
Because that's his plan. You ask forgiveness and you're back in his good graces.
And that's true. But our minds understand that an atonement has taken place.
That's the
So
that's the $64,000.
the $64,000 question, that's what we're talking about. But if we were in a universe where there was no atonement made, no knowledge of atonement, no such thing had ever happened in God's government, and sinners had rebelled, how does God not exact the penalty of the law and still be just to his law? There's a phrase, I looked up what this is called. It's when a law is on the books, but it's not enforced. It's called desuetude. I think it's a French word. Yeah, it's new to me. This is new to me. I looked it up. I wondered if there was a name for it. So I believe it's a French word, and it means to have become obsolete. Desuetude. A law has fallen into desuetude. If a law is on the books, and it's just, the public just doesn't care about it anymore. They don't mess with removing the law. It's not the law of the Medes and Persians around here. So they just ignore it. And it's good advice.
It's like a law that, I heard it once, a law that you're not supposed to spit on the boardwalk.
Yeah, don't spit on the boardwalk. Who is really going to enforce that?
There are no
You know?
boardwalks.
Boardwalks, or you gotta,
Yeah,
you're
yeah.
supposed to tie up your horse on the thing, and there's no more horses.
Yeah, yeah.
Jaywalking in van.
Jaywalking in van. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
There are actually laws on the book in Texas regarding certain activities between men of the same gender. And there was a law against it. But that is a law that we would say has fallen into desuetude. No one enforces it. I don't know when it was ever enforced, but it was on the books in Texas. If a law is not enforced, it's just good advice.
Right.
It's the 10 Commandments, not the 10 helpful sayings or the 10 suggestions. Yeah, right. How can God forgive this sinner and be just to his kingdom? He can't if the sinner has transgressed the law and is in sin. He can't just say, you're off the hook just because. I'm actually using up all my time, so I'm going to move along a little quicker here. I have to finish this one today. So by removing the guarantee of the execution of penalty, it encourages lawlessness in society. If they remove a law, do not steal in our society, and we know that the cops will not enforce theft to where theft is no longer really theft. I may have trusted my good friendly neighbor before. Maybe we get along and he's a nice guy. But I'm going to start to become kind of suspicious. Maybe he'll steal my tools next time he comes over by my house. I better shut my garage door. There's nothing outside of anyone's whim protecting society if a law is not enforced. But
You're talking about the removal of the sanctions or the removal of the law?
Pardon me, that's a good distinction. The removal of the penalty of the law. That's what I said in the first statement, by removing the guarantee of the execution of the penalty. So if we know that the execution of the penalty will not happen, or even may not happen, it removes the influence of that law in the minds of society.
I mean, that's actually happened because, they laugh at you in a city if you report a stolen bicycle, or because there is so much lawlessness, they're so overwhelmed. Something has to be incredibly valuable for them to even care that it's been stolen or defaced or anything that is actually still against the law. It's still on the books, but they don't enforce it because they can, and so there is no way that people feel as if they're going to be held accountable for low-level
Right,
crime.
right. There needs to be a sense that the sanctions of the law are present, good or bad.
Well, even with criminals, what criminal do you know that doesn't say, oh, I'll just get a good lawyer?
Yeah, right. And we know some of them that have gotten very good lawyers. Yeah.
You could say.
Yeah. the big celebrity court cases. That's right. People think they can get away with a lot because they think they can and they do in this life, but they won't in the next. So it creates social disorder if the law is not enforced. It creates social disorder from man to man. It would create social disorder between man and God. On Judgment Day, all of creation points to God and says, on what grounds is this guy forgiven and I'm still under my condemnation? If there's no atonement, you understand. In that type of universe. It would create a distrust between angels and God. I can see the angels saying, you're telling me that the first sin of us guys sent us to hell forever. And you're letting these guys off the hook just because they look like you and think like you? You see? On what grounds is God justified in forgiving these moral creatures, but executing the penalty of the law exactly with no forgiveness to these other creatures, the angels? I think it could also create a distrust or a disunity between angels and man, because we're going to live among the angels someday. I should say we do live among the angels. We just don't talk to them like we talk to each other on a regular basis. But having an eternal perspective is important because we are going to exist forever in one state or another. And we're going to get to meet and have relationships with all those beings. Isn't that interesting? So how is God just in forgiving the human sinner without an atonement? Also, laws are needed not just for criminals. They're needed for all moral beings, even the good ones, because all moral beings are ignorant. And ignorance is not a bad thing. It's just lack of understanding or lack of information. But we will forever be ignorant of all reality compared to God, who knows all there is to know. So all moral beings need proper influences to live right, and God's law describes for us the best way to live right. So how can God be just to his own character? I got to move fast. Let me just say this. If God were not to exact the penalty of the law, as he says he would, then God would be a liar. He would also show partiality or favoritism when he shows grace or favor to others. There would be no reason to believe that he actually values holiness over sin if God does not execute the penalty of the law. So public legal justice is appropriate. It's appropriate treatment for the sinner. Legal justice will give the sinner exactly what is fitting for his behavior and will secure the highest well-being for the rest of the universe. Love will secure the well-being of the public over that of the individual. The public's value is of greater, the value of the good of the public is of greater value than that of one individual, is it not? The good of society is more valuable than the good of one person. And the value of God's good is greater than all of society combined. You remember weeks ago, what did you say? I hear Star Trek out there?
It sounds like the needs of the many outweigh the
Yeah.
needs of the few.
Spock.
Oh, Spock. Cool. I got a Spock. I sounded like Spock. That's all right. He's all right.
Person too, so don't get too big on it.
I'm obviously more of a Spock, I think.
Fewer emotions, yeah.
With my weird ears. That's what I meant. Remember weeks ago I talked about the girl I met on a campus when I was talking to an agnostic atheist guy about how it's just for God to condemn sinners. And the girl came up and she said that she had a brother who was a drug dealer. And the father had to kick the drug dealer brother out to protect the other younger siblings.
Right.
And it illustrated, I mean, it's like God sent her over there to share her story. It was amazing. It illustrated that in real life. So that is appropriate treatment because God has to protect society at large. So God does not personally prefer to execute the penalty. That is not what he personally wants. But we see that he does have public obligations and responsibilities. And I hope that some of this discussion, and some of it's speculation, but I think that it is backed up with the biblical ideas. I think if you really think about it, you'll see that that is the situation of moral beings in the universe. And that what I've described here today is what best suits the way we're made and the nature of God's relationship. So how can God show mercy and forgiveness that he personally desires to give the sinner, yet remain just? So God's gone to great lengths to overcome man's problems. And I'll say this is where we end. Certain conditions must be met for man's problems to be remedied and for public justice to be satisfied, so that God himself will be just in pardoning the sinner. I'm going to read it one more time. Certain conditions must be met for man's problems to be remedied and for public justice to be satisfied, so that God will be just in pardoning the sinner. So what conditions must be met? I need some reverb on the word conditions because it makes people uncomfortable. But we're going to talk a lot about conditions next. And if you want, I'm going to be talking about faith. I'm going to be talking about repentance. And then we're going to talk about atonement, very specifically, because you've been waiting 6 weeks or so. We've actually been talking about atonement the whole time. But if you've been paying attention, your mind will be primed to understand where we're going. But we're going to be talking about faith, repentance, and atonement very soon. So, any questions? I'm right on time. All right.
Talking about
God bless.
conditions that need to be met, we have to be able to trust God.
That's right. We have to be able to trust God.
Yeah.
And that actually, of course you weren't here, but we talked about it earlier on. That is one of the things God has to overcome to regain that relationship. When trust in a relationship is damaged, it's one of the hardest things to rebuild. And God has to gain man's trust back. There's a verse where Jesus, he said that the people were, this is early in his ministry, people were coming to him and believing in him. It says, but he did not entrust himself to them. People were believing, the Greek word there is belief or faith. Jesus was not entrusting. It's exactly the same word.
Exactly.
He was not faithing or believing in them.
That's right.
So there has to be a mutual trust because it's a real relationship. This isn't just a relationship on paper. This is real. And so anyways, that's a good point. And see, it stood right out to you that that's essential for any kind of real lasting relationship.
We have a relationship with him, then when he can't trust us, we let him down.
That's
then
right.
We're under conviction or we're in sorrow,
Mhm.
and we want to turn back to him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, God has to be able to trust us. God talks about entrusting people with things. Entrusting the one who's faithful with little will be faithful with much. That means entrusted. That means God has to believe in you. Not to sound spooky or, too self-help-ish. It's not Dr. Phil. But God has to believe in you. He has to trust your character in a sense as well. So I'm going to end there because church needs to start. So God bless y'all. Thank you.